Today, we'll be looking at a topic which is critical for creating and managing schedules, as well as understanding credit hours and how they're gained within Service. And that topic is registration management. We'll be looking at this both for normal events and time slot events. So first, we'll define what a registration represents within Service. Then we'll talk about how registrations are completed normally by a volunteer. Next, we'll look at methods for modifying that registration process by limiting the number of participants or establishing a wait list, setting restrictions, or even requiring approval of volunteer self-registration. Finally, we'll look at registrations from the admin side and what you can do to engage your participants by modifying existing registrations, making notes, or marking no-shows, as well as a few other tools along the way. So let's start off by defining what a registration represents. So you may be familiar with working within your opportunities, searching and managing existing opportunities, and viewing registered volunteers for an event. Registrations are kind of the entity that ties or links an individual volunteer or a group to a particular shift. It could be one time slot within a particular time slot event, or it could be a normal event. Either way, the registration is what links an individual or a group to one of those shifts. The registration is what contains all the information that Service uses to create reports on the metrics that you're tracking, like hours, time served, any other impact tracking metrics that you've established. Registrations can also contain other information about the registration, like the source of the registration, like if the volunteer completed the registration themselves, or if they used a particular link to do that. They also contain things like the date and time of registration, the date and time of signing in or signing out, any answers to custom registration questions, any notes associated with the registration itself. So all of that information is kind of contained within the registration itself, and that is all reportable. So let's briefly take a look at the registration process from the volunteer perspective. So we're going to step over to the event listing page, kind of like the normal registration process, just so we can establish a baseline, and then we'll look at variations and way to introduce more options. So on your event listing page, which is normally how a volunteer might sign up for a shift, once a volunteer selects a particular event, they can read more about it, and then from there they can sign up or register as a volunteer. When a volunteer does this, if they click on sign up as a volunteer, if they have previously logged in this browser recently, so within like the last 6 months, it'll just remember them and kind of skip this process. As an administrator, you always have to put in your information. You always have to log in because you have access to back-end information. But volunteers, it'll kind of remember them, so it'll speed up the process for them. If a volunteer is new, or perhaps this is a new device, it'll ask them for their email address and first name. And this is just checking, hey, does this person already have a profile? If they do, if the system recognizes their info, it'll ask for their password. If they don't know their password, they can also reset that from the next screen. But if the system doesn't recognize this person's information, it'll have them create a new profile as a part of the registration process. Once that person either creates a new account, or if they log into an existing profile, it will carry on with whatever registration they were working towards. And if it's kind of like a standard event without restrictions or anything else like that, they'll basically just receive a message right away saying they've been registered. They're also going to get a confirmation email with data about that event. So this is kind of like a normal registration. And the volunteer at this point is kind of done. If they'd like to do something else, they have the ability to do that. They could sign up another volunteer for the same shift. Maybe they want to add a family member to that particular shift as well. They could do that directly through here. Maybe they want to register themselves for another event. They could do that as well. But what we've just shown is basically the straightforward kind of normal registration process. Now, there are a lot of different ways to vary that process, starting with how do you direct people to sign up for an event? What we've looked at here initially is your event listing page as a standalone link. right? This is kind of like a standalone page that you can direct volunteers to show your opportunities. From there, they can sign up for a shift. You might also choose to take this same content and embed it into your website. So perhaps instead of sending volunteers to a standalone page, you keep them in your website. You might have a landing page where people tell you if they're new or an existing volunteer or part of a group, and that might change kind of how they interact with this. But you can also just have this content directly embedded into your website, and then volunteers would sign up through there. It's the same registration process. You're just changing how you direct people to this. One other way to direct people to your event listing page or to a particular event is by using source tracked links. So let's say, for example, you are doing an event and you're posting flyers all over a local campus. What you could do is you could, in your admin console, grab a private link to an event. So let's say this event here is what I want to invite people to. I can click the icon here to preview an opportunity. And if we scroll down a little bit, there are a couple links associated with this. You have a private or an opportunity ID with an associated direct event link. This is useful if the event is publicly posted. But you also have a private registration code link, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's a private invite, so you could have an event that is not publicly posted that you still want to invite certain volunteers to. In both of these cases, there are several different options here. There's a long form link and a short form link, and that's true for both this direct event link as well as the private invite. Again, the private invite is like if you don't want to publicly post it. It's kind of exactly what the name implies. But in any of these cases, you could also tack on a source. So I could track people who signed up from a particular link. Let's take this example of posting flyers on a campus. Let's say I have an event that is normally posted. It is publicly available, so volunteers could sign up for this normally. But I want to do a campaign and see if I can get people to sign up by scanning a QR code on some flyers that I post around a campus. So we can use this direct event link. Again, there are 2 copies of this link. I'm going to use the shortened URL. So if we copy this to my clipboard, and I'm just going to go to this link directly. So I'm going to open up an incognito tab so that I'm logged out and then paste that link in. You can see this goes straight to the registration page for this event, right? And that might be sufficient. But if I'd like to know how my campaign did, I'd like to know how many people signed up using these kind of flyers that I'm going to post all over. What I can do is, instead of just going straight to that link or pasting that link normally, I can add at the end of the URL /flyer, right? Maybe that's what I want to track. Or I could add some other information if I wanted to be more specific about particular flyers or flyers on a certain campus. I can do kind of whatever I want to here in terms of the language. But what I'm really telling Service is, hey, I want to track this link. So I can copy this out again because we're going to turn this into a QR code. But just to show you, this goes to the same page, but it has added at the end of the URL this ampersand source equals flyer. Again, this is a source tracked link. The point of this is that anybody who signs up using this source tracked link, I can identify. So I can go in and look at my registrations, I can run a report, and I can see how many people signed up using this link. So this flyer example is one way to do this. You might also have like a Facebook ad that you're trying out and you want to see how good recruiting does off of that. You know, you could change the term. Instead of flyer, maybe make it Facebook ad or whatever you want to track, right? So you can just use whatever normal language you want to here, and then you on the back end can track how these links have done. I've also seen this used in the context of having volunteers recruiting other volunteers and maybe wanting to know how well they did at recruiting. You could give them all their own individual source tracked links. Maybe we want to track, Bruce's recruits. So I could go and add that as basically the source, and then anybody who signs up from this link will get tagged as being one of Bruce's recruits, right? Okay, so we're only kind of partway there with this flyer example. Remember, I copied the link that we created. So just to kind of start over here, I went into preview opportunity details. I grabbed the URL for kind of the direct link. I used the shortened one, and then I added /flyer to the end of that URL. One thing you can do in Service is you can paste any link into the search bar on the main dashboard, and then that will generate a QR code using that URL. So we can take that link that we created, so I added /flyer, and then we can ask Service to create a QR code using that, and it will basically just create a QR code for you. I can right click this, I can copy it, paste it into my flyer, save that if I want to save the image for later. But now I can use this QR code, put it on a flyer. Anybody who scans this QR code and signs up for this event using that will now be identified as having signed up from that flyer. Okay, now we haven't really talked about modifying registrations here, just how we're inviting people to sign up. But that is a very useful tool if you're trying to get some metrics on, how well did this campaign do, or how many people signed up using this particular method. That source tracked link is a pretty helpful way to do that. There is one important thing I want to point out about that. That source tracked link will always identify on the registration itself, so we can run some reports that show what was the source of the registration. But if you would like to, you can also make your system add a tag to volunteer profiles if they create a new account using a source tracked link. So in the system configuration, under your system settings section, there's an option in here to there's an option basically to have volunteers have a tag added to their profile automatically via source tracked links. So it's right here. It says auto tag new volunteer profiles created via source tracking. And we could set this to yes. So the default for this is no if you haven't changed this in your console. But if we turn that on to yes, then any person who creates a new profile using a source tracked link will have that source added as a tag to their profile. It's not necessary to do this, but it can be a helpful metric as well. Okay. So let's actually talk about ways to modify registrations and different ways for you to change that registration process as a whole. So the first thing I want to mention, I kind of alluded to already, and that's that you don't necessarily have to publish your opportunities. You can use private invites for particular events, but generally speaking, you'll want to publicly post your opportunities. When you are managing your opportunities, you can see on the right-hand side the status icon. The color of this and the verbiage here will tell you whether or not an event is publicly posted and if it's available for registrations. If this is fully green, you can see this is telling me this is available, it's online, it's ready for registrations, it's been published. If we look down a little further, I have a different event that's half green, half kind of gray bars. And we can see in this example, this is not currently published. I would have to privately invite people to sign up for this event. So this status is kind of a quick way to glance at that setting. But what it's communicating to you is a couple different features. On every event, if we go in and update an event here, you can set this publish online status. Normally you want to do yes open if you want people to see the event and register for it directly, but we could also have an event that we want hidden and we want to send out a private invite for. But there are also other ways to kind of tweak whether or not something is available. So for example, under the advanced options, you can set a scheduled posting date. Perhaps you do want your event to be live and available for registrations publicly, but only at a particular date and time or after a particular date and time. Maybe you have a special event upcoming that's got like kind of high recruitment value. There's a lot of interest, and perhaps you want it to be a little bit more fair. You could tell everyone, hey, the event's going live for registrations this Friday at noon. So you could actually specify the scheduled posting date. And then the system will withhold the event until that date and time passes. So in this scenario, you would still want to publish your opportunity. So leave it as yes open, but the scheduled posting date will withhold the event until that date and time passes. Your system has a setting for how those events are withheld. So in the system configuration, there's a section called Opportunity Management Settings. And in here, there's a setting for how you want events that are kind of scheduled to be withheld. So you can either have those displayed as coming soon, or you can choose to have the system hide upcoming scheduled posting dates until that time passes. So this is kind of a global setting. Okay, again, that's kind of more in the range of recruitment. Do I want things publicly posted? Do I want to schedule them to go live at a certain time? Do I want them to be hidden and do more of a private invite? But there are also a lot of ways to vary the registration process itself. So in any event that you create, if we go into update an opportunity, there's an entire section called registration restrictions. In here, we can limit who is permitted to register for an opportunity. So you can set restrictions using data that you are tracking. So if you're tracking gender and birth date, you can restrict using those two fields. If you're tracking background checks, you can restrict using that information. If you've set up some custom fields, like for example, maybe I'm asking if volunteers are court ordered, or if they've been approved for certain tasks, you can use those as restrictions. Checklist items can also be used to set restrictions, and groups can be used to set restrictions. The way that all of these restrictions function is you select who is permitted to register, not who's prevented from registering. So let's take an example. Perhaps I have an event upcoming where I need volunteers who are 18 and up who have passed a background check. That is exactly what I would select in here. If you don't have any restrictions on your event, or you don't want any restrictions, you leave everything blank. The default for service for age is 0 to 150, which means any person can register. But again, if you have restrictions, you select who is allowed to register for the event, not who's prevented from registering. There are options within here also to limit visibility of your events using restrictions. This is a pretty kind of specific use case. I wouldn't do this all the time, but if you have an event that you do not want anyone to see unless they already meet the requirements for that event, that's what this function is used for. Normally, and Service's kind of default stance is that you publish your events. You might have restrictions on them, but then volunteers can see your event listing page and all the events that you've publicly posted before they log in. So kind of what we looked at earlier today when we went through a standard registration. I'm not logged in yet. I'm just looking at the events publicly posted. And if I click on one and I click to register, at that point, the system will check if I've already logged in, or it'll have me log in, or it'll have me create a new profile. And at that point, it would then also check all of the restrictions on this event and either produce a failure message or show me that I've been successfully registered for the event. So Service's kind of default stance is that you publicly post things, maybe set restrictions, maybe not, depending on what you're trying to do, not have volunteers log in first. But if you need to, you can have events that are not displayed publicly, and someone would have to log into their account first and then go to view registrations or sign up for an event, and then they would only see what they are available to register for. So you could use that as a pipeline if you'd like to. It just requires that you set restrictions on your events and then limit visibility using those restrictions. So again, any event can have any number of restrictions. The default is that there are not restrictions in place, and then some of those restrictions can be used to limit visibility, like background checks or custom fields or checklist items or groups. All of these have that limit visibility using these restrictions option, and they all default to no. One last thing about restrictions that I want to point out is that you can create a custom failure message. I would typically encourage that you do this if your restriction is a little bit more complex. If you're just using like an age restriction on the event, I think it's best practice to highlight that in the description of your event and just point that out to people before they even try to sign up. But then the system will tell someone, hey, you don't meet the age requirements. But for any other kinds of restrictions you might place on an event, like whether or not someone's passed a background check or using particular custom fields or checklist items, the system won't tell someone, hey, you didn't pass your background check. It's just going to present a failure message that's pretty generic that says you don't meet the requirements for this event. So what I typically would recommend is if you have some restriction like, hey, you have to do this training before you can attend this event, we'll lay that out in the failure message. So if somebody tries to sign up and they get presented with this failure message, you're telling them what their next steps should be, as opposed to just saying thanks, but no thanks. Now, there are a few other ways to modify kind of the registration process. One really simple one that you probably are already aware of, but should definitely know about, is just limiting how many participants you can take. Every event has an option of the number of volunteers needed. For a normal event, you can specify 0, which means it's unlimited. That is the default. Otherwise, you can also specify a limit here. So we could say we need 15 people. For time slot events, you will need to put a number needed for each time slot. You cannot put 0. That would disable each time slot. But we can put a number in here. That's how many spots are available. Think of this like your cap. Once that number is reached, the system will then close registration unless somebody cancels or if you extend the number of positions available. You can also turn on a waitlist if you'd like to. If you enable a waitlist for an event, then Service will open that up once the event fills up. And then volunteers can see that. So if a volunteer is looking at your events and you have the waitlist enabled and that event or that shift is already full, it will say waitlist. And instead of asking the volunteer if they want to register or sign up, they can add themselves to the waitlist. They can join the waitlist. This also allows the volunteer to see how many people are already ahead of them on the waitlist. And then if someone does join the waitlist, so if I were to register for that position, it will add me to the waitlist. I get a different type of message here. And then on the admin side, we can see all of the individuals in the waitlist. So if we go and look at that event, if I go to view the registered volunteers, we can see the people on the waitlist for that particular shift. And then it'll tell you the position of those individuals as well. And you do have the option to move people through the waitlist. In this case, there's just 2 people on the waitlist, so I can either move this person up or this person down. If there's more than 2 people, you might see both of those buttons depending on what position that person is in. But this is just the queue, right? If a volunteer then cancels from this shift, the first person on the waitlist will get added automatically, and they get a confirmation message at that point. That confirmation message could even let them cancel, and then it would go to the next person on the wait list. So this kind of handles itself generally. If you need to, you can supersede the wait list. Obviously, I can move people through the wait list, but if you have like a really long wait list and you just want to kind of supersede the entire thing and add someone directly, you can actually just disable the wait list temporarily. So if we go in and update the event, you could turn off the wait list. It will still preserve all of that data. So we could turn off the waitlist. I could update the event, increase the number of spots available, add someone from the back end, and then re-enable the waitlist. And then it will still be kind of in place. So the waitlist will still exist and all the people, based on their positions will still be there. Okay, one other kind of pretty distinct way to modify how volunteers can be registered for your events is to require approval. So this is a setting available on your events. The function is kind of similar with service projects. We're not really talking about those today, but service projects have like an application approval process. It's kind of a similar concept. But if we look at this event here, if we scroll into, if I go into update this event, and we scroll down to the advanced options, there is a setting that says require approval of volunteer self-registration. If this is set to yes, then volunteers cannot directly add themselves to the event. Instead, they are added to a pending list, and then you have to go through that pending list and approve or reject individuals. So again, this isn't something I would use all the time, but if you have an event where you want to vet every single registration, or you want to pick from a list of applicants. Maybe you want like a whole pool of people to apply, and then you just approve some of those people. Then this can be a helpful setting, because what this does is it allows any number of people to apply for this opportunity. They'll be added as pending registration requests. So you can see there's this icon for this event. This only shows up when you have these in place. And then I can go into this and I can see who all applied. I can see when they requested it, who it is, what they applied for. Obviously, in this case, it's just one event. And then on the right-hand side, if they added notes or if I had custom registration questions, we'll talk about those more in a moment, I could see all of that data in here as well. And then I can use this to select individuals and approve or reject them. At the same time you approve people, you can also send the confirmation message so they'd get an email confirming that they've been added to that shift. So again, not something you want to use necessarily for all of your events, but in particular scenarios where you want to vet all of the registrations or pick from a pool of applicants, then this can be a really helpful tool. For time slot events in particular, you can also set this up to only require approval for the first time, which means as soon as someone has been registered for one time slot in this event, then they have permission to register for other time slots in this event. So let's say, for example, you have a position that is a skilled labor position, and you want to vet volunteers the first time that they register, but thereafter they're now approved. There's a few ways to handle that. You could use a restriction to handle that kind of exchange, and then you just mark something on the volunteer's profile. This works especially well if you have things like mandatory trainings before the first engagement. You might just create the trainings as their own events and have people sign up for those trainings, and then once they attend, you mark off a checklist item, right? But if it's a little bit more loose than that and you're kind of just like approving on the fly, then this first time only option is really nice, because then you can approve a volunteer for their first registration in this time slot event, but thereafter, once you've approved them one time or just manually registered them on the back end, thereafter the volunteer can sign up for as many shifts as they want to. You don't have to approve every single registration. Okay, there's one other very important kind of piece of context for modifying these registrations that I wanted to point out. I kind of alluded to it earlier, and that's the idea of custom registration questions. So if you have an event where you are manually approving people, or perhaps you're placing people a little bit based on some other information, or you just need them to confirm, like, yeah, I did review the training material before they register, you can add additional questions to a specific opportunity that don't show up on your other events. So for example, I have in my system right now an event that's kind of functionally a potluck event. It's called Meals for Families. Volunteers are bringing food for a particular family, each of the time slots, essentially. But when someone registers, I want them to tell me what type of dish are you bringing and what's the name of the dish. So these are called custom registration questions. They do not show up on every single event. They only show up where I have selected them. So I have these selected specifically for this event and none other event in my system, because this is kind of the event that they have to do with. But when someone registers for this event, they must answer these two questions, and then those responses get tied to the volunteer's registrations. So if I look at any person who's registered for this event, on the right-hand side, we have an icon that says View Custom Registration Questions. If I click into that, I can see those responses, and I can modify those if I needed to. The primary function that I'm using this for in this context is I'm actually displaying this data to volunteers. This is not something you would normally want to do for most of your events, but you do have an option on any event to display registered volunteers publicly. And you can see for this event, I've said yes and include those custom registration questions. There are other options in here to not include that, or to not display publicly, that's the default, or to include registration notes instead. But in this case, I want people to see what the person ahead of them signed up for and what they said they're bringing, so that they can kind of collaborate even if they don't know one another. So if we look at this event from the volunteer perspective, I can have a volunteer who's, maybe they want to bring a meal on Tuesday, June 17th. They can click to view the registered volunteers, so who registered ahead of them, what that person said they're bringing, and then they can kind of use that to, collaborate without necessarily knowing who this person is. One quick aside, you can change how the name is formatted in this listing. This is a setting in the system configuration. So by default, it's last name, comma, first name, but you could have it just be last name, first initial, or first name, last initial. And you can also change the order of that. So that's a setting in the system configuration. But you can see in this case, the primary purpose is that I can then have volunteers see who's signed up ahead of them and what did those people say that they're bringing. Okay, so that's one particular example, obviously, of using those custom registration questions. Otherwise, you might also have a scenario, again, where you need volunteers to identify that, yes, I have watched the training material. You can make a restrictive custom registration question that requires a particular answer, or you can make custom registration questions that are just giving you more information about the volunteer. Again, perhaps you're placing people after they apply for this shift. So that could also be a use for those. But the idea is you have an external set of questions that aren't on your general application that might get employed or deployed for particular opportunities. Okay, kind of the last subject today as it pertains to registrations is how do we manage these and what can we do with those registered volunteers? So kind of engaging with them. We've done a little bit of this as we've been kind of poking around in here. But let's say, for example, I need to email all the people who are signed up for this event, right? There's a number of ways to do this. We can do it directly from this screen. So again, from the main dashboard, we went into search and manage existing opportunities. But from here, I could select a particular event or a set of events. And then up at the top, there's a bulk actions menu. And I can say, let's send an email to these people. So to the registered volunteers, let's email them. If you are selecting time slot events, you can also choose to limit who you're emailing. So let's say, for example, I have a kind of large scale time slot event here, the sort and repack. Maybe we're a little bit wary of a weather event that's happening tomorrow. What I could do is say, let's email all the registered volunteers, but only for tomorrow. I could do this for multiple events at one time, but that date filter only applies to time slot events. So you can email from a screen like this, but of course I could also go into manage the registered volunteers. And from this menu, I could also pull up, okay, here's tomorrow's shift. I'm going to select all those people. And then down at the bottom, there are options to manage those registrations in terms of removing people, sending emails, sending text messages, marking no-shows, things like that. So if a volunteer didn't attend a shift, the idea would be that you mark them as a no-show. So you can select a particular person or multiple people and mark them as a no-show. You can do that from this menu. If you are using the sign-in console, which we're not really talking about today, but if you're using the sign-in console, then this can be made a little bit more simple because you can identify, who didn't sign in and then use that to mark no-shows. On this screen, that's a visual indicator, so it's kind of helpful just to see that. But on the previous menu, if we're looking at multiple events, I could select multiple events at one time, and the drop down here, there's an option to mark no-shows in bulk. This will pull up any person who did not sign in for a shift that has already occurred. And then I can take those people and kind of vet this list and say, okay, actually, I remember that Alejandra was there. Let's sign her in. But then everybody else, we're going to mark as a no-show. Right. And doing this does kind of two things. It removes all these people from those shifts so they don't get credit. And then it also adds no-show notes to their profile, which is something you can search by. In the volunteer menu, in the advanced volunteer search, you can run a search under participation for volunteers based on the number of no-shows or cancellations, or a combination of both within a certain time frame or just in general. Okay, so of course we can mark no-shows and we can send emails to our registered volunteers, but I also want to point out some of the other tools that we were looking at. If I go into view the registered volunteers for an event, on the left-hand side, this calendar icon tells you when this person was registered and by whom, so you can see that data relayed here. You can also click on this icon to adjust how many credit hours this person is receiving. I mentioned at the top today that registrations are kind of what carry that packet of, how many hours does this person get for this shift? These registrations always have a default, and that's based on what you established on the event. So this particular event is from 1 to 4 p.m. I also made the credit hours of this 3 hours to kind of correlate with that time. That doesn't necessarily have to be the case, but that's the default for this event. So if someone's hours are not being adjusted, whether they use the sign-in console to sign in and out, or if I clicked on this to manually adjust their hours, then people will receive 3 credit hours for this event. That's what the registration is worth. But I could also always go in here and click on this and then adjust how many hours this one person is receiving without affecting the rest of the registered volunteers. So we can see that here. We can see the sign-in console markers. On the right-hand side, if there was a note attached to this registration, we could see that as well. So this is where you'll see things like sign in, sign out times, or if you allow registration notes. The right-hand side also has impact tracking. If you're tracking additional metrics like what did you do during your shift, maybe you're letting people give you information about like pounds of food sorted or grocery bags prepared or different kind of metrics. You can have those logged and recorded next to each registration as well. Okay. In general, all of these registrations will then show up in your reports, right? So if we look at report management under the volunteer management menu, the vast majority of these reports, there's some exceptions in here like email analytics, for example, or the checklist status report, but the vast majority of these reports will give you your hours and your numbers of volunteers and your numbers of times served or activities based on those registrations. So if we run a report in here, the system is looking for what registrations occurred or what shifts occurred in this time frame, who was registered, how many hours did they get, and then whatever other data you want to include, right? You can include things like the registration source. We talked about that earlier with that idea of like a flyer, or you can include things like sign-in time or registration notes or registration date and time. So there's a lot of information kind of carried in that registration, all the impact tracking metrics, that can be conveyed in reports and kind of rolled up into one larger form report. As we are specifically looking at like this report type, this custom participation report, this one has a lot of options. You can include a lot of data in here. You can limit it to a particular set of volunteers or opportunities. If you want to learn more about reporting, we've done webinars on that more specifically. But I just want to point out, if we run this report, it's a pretty plain spreadsheet. So you can use this to kind of give yourself, access to all of these different columns and then kind of sort by those, right? Like the registration source, for example. We can see in this context, I can see direct registrations, the volunteer did it themselves, or walk-ins, or like admin. So there's different things that you'll see through here. If I was using that flyer source, I would see that listed in here as well. So you can kind of like sort by a column like that and view all of your hours that way, kind of run your own totals. So again, in general, the registrations are kind of what carry your reports. It's the volunteer signed up for a shift, and that packet might contain all kinds of other information about, who it is or how they signed up or what it's worth, what impact tracking was related to that, what are their answers to the custom registration questions, all of that kind of stuff. So registrations are a pretty dense subject. It's something that obviously touches a lot of parts of the database, but they're also relatively simple in terms of, you're attaching an individual to a particular shift. So a question came in: if a volunteer is registered but does not show up and we forget to mark them as a no-show, does service count the hours and registration? It's a very good question. The default stance of service is that if a volunteer is registered for a shift, they receive the credit hours of that shift. So you will want to mark no-shows if you have any no-call no-shows. Obviously, if volunteers are canceling their own registrations, which they can do through things like the confirmation email, I just want to show you in your system configuration under email message content. The first thing in here is your registration email confirmation. If we preview this, you can see kind of the context of what this email looks like. There's a cancellation link in here that volunteers can use. So the registration confirmation email and the reminder emails have this cancellation option. So if people have canceled, obviously no worries. They've been removed from the event. They're not getting credit. But otherwise, the default stance from service is that if someone is registered for a shift, they receive full credit for that shift. So you do want to mark no-shows, whether you're using that bulk action based on the sign-in console, or if you're just going into an event after the fact and marking no-shows in that way. If someone did not attend an event, you do want to mark them as a no-show. Otherwise, they will be receiving credit. Now, if they called you and told you they weren't going to be there, then I would just unregister them just to not have that mark on their profile. But if they were a no-show, I always would mark it as a no-show because you can search by that kind of metric. Okay, and then one other thing kind of just tacked on to that, if you are using the sign-in console to have volunteers track their attendance, so both signing in and signing out, then that will also automatically adjust activity. So if you are having people use the sign-in console to just sign in and not sign out, then volunteers will receive the default credit hours. But again, that's true for whether they signed in or not. It's just helpful in marking no-shows. But if people are both signing in and out, then the system will adjust activity based on those times. And again, if you want to see more about the sign-in console, we also recently did a webinar on that specifically. Okay, so we covered a lot of information today in terms of what registrations are, the different ways to set those up in Service. We kind of walked through a lot of different concepts in terms of recruiting people to how do we actually allow them to register, or what can they see. So if you have any further questions about this, please do not hesitate to reach out to our customer support team. You can always contact them using the Need Help button when you're logged into your account. Click on that. You can type in a question or a topic here. Let's say you want to learn more about reporting. You can search for terms that we talked about today, like source tracking, stuff like that. We have a lot of articles in here, but you can also always click on Contact Us and submit a ticket to our customer support team.